Vlahovic is number one on the January list, like we say, but there are other names in contention.
I'll refer you to my mailbag again, where you can read in depth what the latest situation was around Dusan Vlahovic, who was Arsenal's key target for the striker position coming into this window. Really, it was a summer plan to fill that position, but if Arsenal can bring a deal forward to January, then they would like to do it. It may see them steal a march on some of their rivals. For players like Vlahovic, backups like Dominic Calvert-Lewin and Alexander Isak, this is more desire than deals waiting to go. I feel it's players that are heavily admired at Arsenal, with Vlahovic at the top of the list. And my information is that they would be prepared to do the deal. They would be prepared to fund it. And I think Fiorentina would be prepared to cash in on him with 18 months to go and the rejection of a new contract. This may be the point at which they can extract maximum value in the remainder of his term. But whether he wants to do it now, whether his agent, who is going to play a key role in this situation, wants to do it, is a completely different matter. And there are reported doubts about that element. There are suggestions that he's going to stay and decide in the summer with more options in front of him. I know that he is very keen to break goal-scoring records, or more goal-scoring records in Italy. And so it's a really delicate situation that, with quite a few days left in the window to go, I don't think Arsenal are going to turn their back on. A lot of people keen to suggest where that money would come from. Well, I think it's the sort of thing that Arsenal would need to lean on their ownership for support. Once again, we saw it in the case of Thomas Partey, for example. But when you speak to people around the game, the sort of numbers being touted for Vlahovic are not ridiculous for a player in that position, and his age, his profile, the sort of productivity that he's shown this season and may do into the future. So I find it quite fascinating that Arsenal are prepared to mix it in that market. And if they don't get him, James, they do admire, as we said, other players as well.
Yes, certainly. I mean, Arsenal spent a lot of money on transfer fees in the summer. Albeit they rebalanced their wage bill a bit in that process as well. And I think, the owners clearly have had to intervene to do that, and would do the same in January. I think the money might have been there in the summer for this striker. I think they knew, even last summer, they would have liked to have done a centre-forward. They would have liked to bring somebody in. It probably was dependent on moving somebody on, potentially Alexander Lacazette. We know they liked, for example, Tammy Abraham, who ended up at Roma. Ultimately, that deal didn't happen. So this has been on the agenda for some time. It is a question of plans being moved forward, because not only of the striking situations regarding Lacazette, Aubameyang and Nketiah, but also perhaps the opportunity that is in front of Arsenal. That I don't know if they necessarily expected to be in contention for a top four place at this point in the season, with rivals struggling in some respects, and an opportunity there to go on and achieve Champions League football, which would be a fantastic result this season. So there is a big prize at the end of the season for Arsenal if they push on. A striker, maybe perhaps more so than any other position, would help them do that. The addition of a reliable goal scorer who could lead this team, be the spearhead for this attack into the next few years, at this point would be a massive step forward for Mikel Arteta's project. Vlahovic is number one on the January list, like we say, but there are other names in contention. I know, David, you've reported on interest in Dominic Calvert-Lewin, Alexander Isak as well. We've written about those on The Athletic. They're both players they really, really admire. I think maybe less likely in January, but if this search goes on until the summer, I think they'll certainly be on the agenda once again.
And this is where I'm going to lean on Mark, because all of these options we talk about have pros and cons. What is Mikel Arteta looking for? Because he's got some really exciting attacking options from wide areas in the number 10 position. They've blended pretty well with Alexandre Lacazette. What do you think he would be seeking from that position if they were to make a new signing?
Yeah, I'm going to sort of defer to a piece that James and I did recently, looking at the potential strikers that Arsenal could go for, and I think it would be ideally kind of a blend of Lacazette and Aubameyang in terms of that hybrid of someone who can kind of drop in, link the play really well, hold up the play, and others can play off him, but also be able to stretch the opposition and obviously run in behind as well, which is easier said than done as to a player who can do both of those. But I think Vlahovic could be that sort of player, and I can come on to why. But without being too facetious, well, someone who can score goals. Now, obviously, that's very obvious, but I was just looking back at since the start of last season that Aubameyang and Lacazette have scored 31 goals between them in the Premier League, which is a good return. But Dusan Vlahovic, for example, has scored 38 goals just on his own in that time. But I think he's a very good penalty box striker, Vlahovic. He can link the play a lot better more recently than I think people give him credit for. He can hold it up. He's big, he's powerful and strong, especially considering his young age. He's a different type of profile to the likes of Isak, who's more of a runner, a carrier, more likely to maybe pop up in maybe the left sort of sided area of the pitch, more of that half space, which for me makes me think maybe he could get in the way of some of Arsenal's creative players behind, whereas Vlahovic could maybe be that more of that focal point. So I think Isak is an interesting one, but he's a completely different profile of player to Vlahovic, for example. I think looking at Calvert-Lewin, again, someone that's been spoken about quite widely. We know what sort of player he is. Obviously, he's been in the Premier League for some period. He's someone who maybe won't get as involved in the build-up play. He used to be one to sort of run the channels, and now he's sort of focused on just being in and around the penalty box and getting on the end of chances. So maybe unlike Lacazette, he maybe wouldn't be that one to link the play quite as much. So you look at his shots, Calvert-Lewin, he's someone who just scores almost exclusively in and around the 6-yard box. So reliant on delivery, but again, a completely different striker. And I think that overall, not to build that hype too much, I think Vlahovic is that kind of hybrid more so than these other options that we're speaking about.
And if it's not to be one of those three, Mark, what sort of names might be in the frame? We've seen Arsenal linked in the past with Ivan Toney, Jonathan David, Darwin Núñez and various others.
Yeah, I think it might be a bit too much of an ask for Toney. I mean, he's done well since he's moved up to the Premier League, more so in his kind of hold-up play and linking with others. I think that, I don't know what James thinks, I think that maybe it's a bit too much of an ask to ask him to be that kind of goal-scoring focal point, because he's yet to really prove it in the Premier League. He's done brilliantly in the lower leagues, in the EFL. He scored for fun in the Championship, but I think you're talking about Arsenal here. I think that they want someone who can deliver from a goal scoring perspective if they're going to fork out a lot of money. So I think it might be a little bit too much for Toney. I think Jonathan David's an interesting one because he's someone who to play for Lille, of course, that he was someone that was on Liverpool's shortlist when they were looking for reinforcements, and they obviously went with Diogo Jota at the start of last summer. And he's again a little bit of a different sort of profile of player. He plays more as a second striker, more of a runner in a 4-4-2 for Lille. He's got he developed a really strong partnership with Burak Yilmaz at Lille, and I don't think he'd necessarily be that kind of focal point that maybe Arsenal are looking for, again, which Vlahovic could fit into. He's more of a, currently, that's not to say you couldn't adapt, but currently more of a someone who works in partnership. So I think he'd be an interesting one, certainly a very good player. He's scored 12 goals in 20 league appearances in the French league this season, so he's certainly still got an eye for goal, but a different profile of player altogether. And Darwin Núñez, again, with people that we've all listed in this piece on The Athletic, but he's similarly a little bit more kind of like an Isak, where he's maybe a bit more of a runner, a bit more of a carrier. Has been playing less of a kind of a focal point central striker this season. He's been playing a bit more on the left in a 3-4-3 for Benfica. So again, would he have to adapt in terms of the forwards that Arsenal have, and maybe stay out of their way and not get too much sort of as involved on the left hand side, and maybe stay centrally? So that's not to say that any of these players can't adapt to Arsenal's system, but it's more to say that the kind of an oven-baked, ready fit would maybe be more in the mould of Vlahovic than those other options.
I think Mark makes a great point there about wanting something sort of oven-baked. Arsenal did a big overhaul on their squad last season and brought in quite a number of relatively young players, 6 players under the age of 23. I think when it gets to this summer, they're going to be a bit more flexible about that age profile, because they're looking to put kind of, cherries on cakes, basically. They're looking for the finishing touches to this team, to this squad, to really push on. So, while I don't think they'll be looking at players in their late 20s or anything like that, I think, people approaching their prime years, 24, 25, I don't think that would be an issue for Arsenal at this point of time. I think they do want someone who is a reliable goal scorer. We're talking about potentially losing Aubameyang, potentially losing Lacazette. That shortfall needs to be made up. I do think Jonathan David's a really interesting name because he's somebody who Arsenal watched quite closely when he was even younger, when he was playing in Belgium, I believe. And he's someone who's been a bit of a different player this season. Last year he was working incredibly hard off the ball. I think the reason he came up on Liverpool's radar was that he profiled quite similarly to Roberto Firmino in some respects. This year in Liga, he's added goal scoring to that, and he's been very prolific. So he's showing kind of both sides of the game that Arsenal are looking to find. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was a name that's also figuring in conversations that Arsenal are having about their new centre-forward.
I'm going to take that one just because he's got the first and second names the same as mine, just in a different order. And I'm also going to throw another name in the mix for fans of Arsenal and other clubs to watch, and that's Rafa Leao at AC Milan, who's coming on really impressively. He's good age profile, great physical, technical, goal scoring. Needs a bit more on the numbers, but I think he's already being watched by a number of clubs, and that will only continue. He's got a couple of years left on his contract, and been really impressed by him. In fact, part of the reason I went to watch Liverpool against AC Milan in the Champions League in San Siro was to see him play, and he was injured. But he's back fit now, and certainly people should keep an eye on him. Boys, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure. Real great detail there and insight, and we'll look forward to seeing how the rest of this window pans out and Arsenal's search for a striker continues.